Our lecture this evening would not be possible without the kind generosity of Lois Wise, who established the Rose Wohlgemuth Weisman Women's Voices Lecture in honor of her mother. Her gift to the university allows us to bring community women of distinction through the Women's Voices Endowed Lecture Fund. And we would also like to thank the residents of Cuyahoga County for their support of this event through the generous public grant from the Cuyahoga Arts and Culture. And to place this event in context, I'd like to suggest that thoughtful, provocative writing about cultural identity has been rare in this country, so that it makes it even more remarkable that in 1935, 20 years before the landmark Supreme Court decision Brown versus the Board of Education, Edith Anisfield Wolf, a Cleveland poet and philanthropist with a strong sense of social justice, created a book prize to honor writers who have contributed to our understanding of race and racism. Over time, many outstanding works of fiction and nonfiction have been selected for the prize. The list starts with such legendary storytellers as Langston Hughes, Ralph Ellison, Zona Neale Houston, and Alan Paton, and includes 4 Nobel Prize laureates. And to put this evening into a slightly different context, I'd also like to recognize Mary Louise Hahn, a friend and colleague of tireless energy and imagination, who, on behalf of the Cleveland Foundation, has collaborated with the Humanities Center in our ongoing partnership with the Anisfield Wolf Book Award Committee. And also this year, working with Mary Louise and Dean Peter Whiting and the Humanities Center, has created a new fellowship, an Anisfield Wolf Sages Fellowship, in which the fellow in residence will offer in his or her seminar material that is based and grounded in the values set forth in the Anisfield Wolf Award criteria. The first recipient of the Anisfield Wolf Sages Fellowship is Professor Lisa Nielsen, who joins us this evening along with members of her seminar. Lisa? And like the orchestral conductor acknowledging the band, Lisa has pointed you out to a seminar. Mary Helen Stefaniak is a native of Milwaukee who grew up in a bicultural household. Her father was born in Milwaukee, her mother in Gordon, Georgia. She divides her time between Iowa City, where she and her husband John live in a 150-year-old stagecoach house they recently restored, and Omaha, where she teaches at Creighton University. Stefaniak's first novel, The Turk and My Mother, received the 2005 John Gardner Fiction Book Award from Binghamton University and was recognized by the Wisconsin Library Association for Outstanding Literary Achievement. It has been translated into several languages, and her collection of short fiction, Self-Storage and Other Stories, received the Wisconsin Library Association's 1998 Banter Award for Literary Excellence. Ms. Stefaniak is a writer of fiction and essays whose works have appeared in many publications, including Iowa Review, Epoch, Short Story, the Yale Review, and the Antioch Review. Her latest novel, from which she'll be reading this evening, The Cailiffs of Baghdad, Georgia, as I mentioned, received the 2011 Anisfield Wolf Award for Fiction. And in the words of juror and distinguished poet Rita Dove, the novel is a rollicking tale that manages to speak seriously to the tragedy of ignorance and the damage caused by fear. The Cailiffs of Baghdad, Georgia was also selected by the independent booksellers as the independent next great read. In September 2010, please join me in welcoming Professor Mary Helen Stefaniak.
Thank you, John Orlock, for that introduction and also for inviting me here. Thanks too to the Baker Nord Center for the Humanities, and to Case Western Reserve University, where we are right now. And I also want to thank all of you for coming this evening. It's nice to see all of you here. I would like to make a special thank you, though, to the Anisfield Wolf Book Awards. My first trip to Cleveland was in September of this past September, when I came to be honored with the Anisfield Wolf Book Award for Fiction, which I shared with Nicole Krauss for her novel, Great House. And when you look at the past awardees from Langston Hughes to be included in any way, shape, or form in such a group is just an honor that I can't really express. So I'll stop talking about it. And before I get so awed by the invisible company I keep that I can't move forward. I'm going to read from, as this talk is called, or this evening's program is called, A Bedouin at the Window, readings from the Cailiffs of Baghdad, Georgia. And I plan to read some portions and then to talk kind of in between those portions and again at the end. And if I do not if I do not address the theme to sufficient, to your satisfaction, that's what you should ask me about. Then you should say, where's the genius? Where's the celebrity? Although actually, the protagonist, the hero of this novel is a genius, is quite literally a genius, and his talents are very important to what happens in the book. There are dark things that happen in this book, and the parts that I'm going to read tonight do not specifically touch on the dark things, although I think you can feel them running like a subtext through some of the scenes. I think and if not, as I say, we'll talk about them in the question and answer period. But I thought I would start by reading just from the very beginning of the book, the first page and a half, rather than, I know some of you already know what the book is about, or you've read the program, but I'm just going to read rather than talk about it, the first page and a half, which will tell you most of what you need to know. About the only thing I need to add to it is that the narrator here is 11 years old. Her name is Gladys Cailiff, and she's from Three Step, Georgia. And Three Step, Georgia is a very tiny town that in 1938-39 is destined to be transformed into the Baghdad, Georgia of the title of the novel. I think that's probably the only thing I need to tell you. I should also warn you that the hero, genius, does not appear in this part that I'm going to read right now. So this is the first chapter, Miss Spivey, For and Against. Miss Grace Spivey arrived in Three Step, Georgia in August of 1938. She stepped off the train wearing a pair of thick-soled boots suitable for hiking, a navy blue dress, and a little white tam that rode the waves of her red hair at a gravity-defying angle. August was a hellish month to step off the train in Georgia, although it was nothing, she said, compared to the 119 degrees that greeted her when she got off the boat one time in a place she called El Basra. I believe her remark irritated some of the people gathered to welcome her on the burned grass alongside the tracks. When folks are sweating through their shorts, they don't like to hear that this is nothing compared to someplace else. Irritated or not, the majority of those present were inclined to see the arrival of the new school teacher in a positive light. Hard times were still upon us in 1938, but like my mama said, we weren't no poorer than we'd ever been, and the citizens of Three Step were in the mood for a little excitement. Miss Spivey looked like just the right person to give it to them. She was, by almost anyone's standards, a woman of the world. She'd gone to boarding school since she was 6 years old. She'd studied French in Paris and drama in London, and during what she called a fruitful intermission in her formal education, she had traveled extensively in the Near East and Africa with a friend of her grandmother's, one Janet Miller, who was a medical doctor from Nashville, Tennessee. After her travels with Dr. Miller, Miss Spivey continued her education by attending Barnard College in New York City. She told us all that at school the first day. When my little brother Ralphford asked what did she study at Barnard College, Miss Spivey explained that Barnard, which she wrote on the blackboard, was the sister school of Columbia University, of which she expected we all had heard. It was there, she told us, in the midst of trying to find her true mission in life, that she wandered one afternoon into a lecture by the famous John Dewey, who was talking about his famous book, Democracy and Education. Professor Dewey was in his 70s by then, Miss Spivey said, but he still liked to chat with students after a lecture, especially female students, she added, sometimes over coffee, and see in their eyes the fire his words could kindle. It was after this lecture and subsequent coffee that Miss Spivey had marched to the Teachers College and signed up all aflame. 2 years later, she told a cheery blue-suited woman from the WPA that she wanted to bring democracy and education to the poorest, darkest, most remote and forgotten corner of America. They sent her to Three-Step, Georgia. Now that kind of introduces you, I guess, not only to Gladys, the narrator, although she doesn't mention herself, but to the situation which the story begins. And I'd just like to mention here that the book is a kind of, I mean, it's fiction, it's a novel, but it draws on a lot of history. It draws a little bit on my mother's family history. My mother is from this part of Georgia and would have been about Gladys's age in 1938. It also well, you'll see it draws on all sorts of eras of history, but I also found some particular people that were extremely, it sounds crass to say it, but useful to me in writing the book. And once in a while, I think if one of them comes up, a historical character, now John Dewey I don't have to identify for you, but another historical character that I've mentioned thus far that you may not have heard of is this Dr. Janet Miller from Nashville, Tennessee. And when I got the rather strange, who is a real person from Nashville, Tennessee, and when I got the rather strange idea of writing this book that put together Baghdad, or whatever the whole broad swath of history and culture that Baghdad represents, and Georgia, kind of rural, small-town Georgia, where my mother grew up, I initially, in something of a panic, was looking for, possible ties between these two things. Because I absolutely was determined to do it. And I went to the library, and I went to found the card catalog, books about Baghdad, and I came upon a book there on the shelf, published in 1934, and still on the shelf at Creighton University's library, where I teach, which I think is a good thing. A book called The Camells of Baghdad, written by this very person, Dr. Janet Miller. And she was indeed, the book is about a little sojourn she spent, kind of it's more like a travel log of a time she spent in Baghdad between the time she was in the Far East and the time she was battling the tsetse fly, sleeping sickness in Africa, because she was indeed a physician, a kind of one-woman doctor without borders. She had her, there were people who wanted her to be nominated for a Nobel Prize at one time. And yet, she was pretty, I looked for more information on her and could find really nothing except this book that she had written, which was obviously not, her main oeuvre. And the wonderful thing about Dr. Janet Miller was that she was from Tennessee. And Tennessee was only one state north of Georgia, which is where I was trying to set my story. So a person who had written a book about Baghdad and Persia, actually, called The Cailiffs of Baghdad, was a kind of a linchpin I could hold on to. I should also mention, well, as long as I'm talking about Dr. Miller, because I won't think of this again. As I said, I couldn't find any other information or any other books by her, or I just couldn't find her on the internet. But a few months after the book came out, I got an email, and the subject line of the email was, "Janet Miller was my great-great-great-great-aunt." Well, now right away I felt a little nervous, because following my rule for writing historical fiction, which is, it does not contradict what is known. So there's an awful lot of, that gives you a lot of leeway to create what, is not known, but fits. I was, a little leery about opening that email, but as it turned out, the great-great-great-great-grandniece of Dr. Janet Miller, whose name is Virginia Burton, thanked me for giving great-aunt Janet another shot at fame. And she, in fact, sent me a photograph of her that, with her two sisters, one of whom is the great-great-great-great-grandmother of the woman who sent me the email. And if you go to the website that Gladys Cailiff, the narrator, recommends to you at the very end of this book, which is a website maintained by the people of the fictional town of Baghdad, Georgia, you'll find a photo gallery, and you can see that picture of Dr. Janet Miller. So she might not have any fame anymore, but maybe now she will. And she's certainly a person who was quite the celebrity while she was still alive. Well, now I'm going to introduce you to the character who I said was a genuine genius in the book, and he is in fact the main character. I'm going to read you the beginning of a chapter called "A Bedouin at the Window," which is where the title of the talk comes from. One thing I didn't mention in the little part that I read, but that you may already know, is that one of the ways in which Miss Grace Spivey, the new teacher, shakes things up in this town, aside from ditching the curriculum and spending a lot of time reading to them from the 1001 Nights, or she doesn't ditch the whole curriculum, but a more worldly education she provides for the white children in her school, because she's teaching in the white country school where Gladys is a student. But one of the big things she does is she revives the town festival as a Baghdad bazaar, complete with camels, which they go off to the circus to get. And Theo Boykin becomes very much involved in that, our genius young Theo Boykin. But he is initially involved in a Halloween party that Miss Spivey decides to host for the whole town. And when Gladys Cailiff hears that Miss Spivey's going to have a haunted house at her Halloween party, she said, well, the first thing she said was, well, you have to get Theo Boykin on that project, our neighbor, Theo Boykin. The Cailiffs of the title are a white family, and Theo Boykin is a black. I don't think I need to tell you anything else. So this will introduce you to Theo Boykin. Theo Boykin was the smartest person in Piedmont County, and everybody knew it. Whether folks liked it or not was another matter. Theo, who was about the same age as my brother Force, 17, could do sums in his head better than Mrs. Bibbin's adding machine at the store, and he could read you anything he laid his hands on, even if he never saw it before in his life, without ever stumbling over a single word. One 4th of July, when the parade marshal of Piedmont County waited till the last minute to line up his post-parade program, he couldn't find but one person in Claytonville, Brennan, and Three Step combined who knew all the words to the Declaration of Independence. Theo was 10 or 11 at the time. You'd better believe a murmur went through the audience when he stepped up on the podium on the courthouse lawn in Claytonville that day, but by the time he got to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, he had the whole audience in the palm of his hand. I'm told they applauded louder and longer for Theophilus Boykin than they had for the tap dancers or the Land of Liberty tableau. He could draw, too. Miss Templeton, his teacher at the colored school out in the country, said one time that Theo was a Renaissance man, by which she meant he could do anything he put his mind to. This led to Miss Spivey calling him Signor da Vinci later on, when he was drawing up plans for the Baghdad Bazaar, beautiful sketches with numbers and arrows to show what went where. None of us knew who Signor da Vinci was until we had a lesson at school on him and Michelangelo that included the opportunity to lie on your back and paint whatever you wanted on the underside of your desk for as long as your arm could stand it. Miss Spivey did some things right. So. When Theo came to three-step school to see about Miss Spivey's haunted house, Force and Ralford and I came with him, as did his brother Eugene, a quiet boy who was a little younger than Theo, but bigger and taller than all of us. Eugene waited outside, leaning against the trunk of the walnut tree. Miss Spivey invited him to come in, but he declined. Theo hesitated at the back of the schoolroom himself, which caused me to remember something from a long time before. When I was in the first grade, my brother Force brought Theo to school with us one time. I don't recollect why. Our teacher, Miss Chandler, at the time, met us at the door and explained that even though Theo Boykin was smart as a whip, the law prohibited her from allowing him inside three-step school. She might have said that she could not permit him to get a foot in the door, but what I heard was to put his foot on the floor, which made me wonder. If somebody would pick him up and carry him in, could Theo come inside? Or what if we put a carpet down for him to step on? I had some idea that his feet were the problem, like ours in walnut time. And I know I thought about pointing out to Miss Chandler in my first grade wisdom that the bottoms of Theo's feet were the lightest part of him and no threat at all to her floor. I had noticed this paleness on the hands and feet of colored people only recently. In fact, it was Theo Boykin who pointed it out to me. We were all cleaning white clay off ourselves after digging some out of a hole in the Boykins' yard when Theo rubbed his palms together and said, "Well, look at here, Gladys, that white dirt bleached the color right off my hands and feet." This seemed plausible to me, especially in Piedmont County where white dirt is abundant. His mama set me straight on the matter. She scolded him for teasing. In the doorway of three-step school, Theo Boykin took off his work shoes and carried them, one in each hand, across the threshold. He set his two bare feet flat on the pine floor, under which crickets were singing their swan song, it being late in October. You could see him take a quick inventory of the place, the neat rows of desks in 3 graduated sizes, the map that pulled down like a window shade, and the blackboard as big as the whole front wall of the room, except where the door to the half room broke into it. The long, tall windows, 4 on each side of the room, had glass in every pane but one, due to a ball game last winter. Miss Spivey, who was waiting for us, acted like it was the most natural thing in the world for Theo Boykin to step inside three-step school. "Come in," she said, "and please take a seat." But she did seem a little shy about telling him what she had in mind for the haunted house. "Well, I thought we'd hang some sheets and wet string in the half room," Miss Spivey said. "Make people walk through it in the dark." Theo paced the length of the glorified closet that constituted the half in our 1.5 room schoolhouse. It had no windows and no electric light and was almost completely dark. When he stood in the doorway, his white shirt and expertly patched gray pants were easier to see than the expression on his face. Miss Spivey said, "What do you think?" "Ma'am," he said, "a white sheet never fooled anybody. What you need is something moving. We can fix it so if you open the door, things drop down and slide around, go swooping like they're coming to get you like that. Spiders are good too and easy to fix up. And I might have time to make a skeleton if I could get some help with that. I've got a skull we could use." We all held our breath for a second when he said that. "A deer skull," he said. They're about the right size. Skeleton's the best, Miss Spivey. Nothing's scarier than a skeleton rattling its bones. Do y'all know why? We all knew just to wait. But Miss Spivey said, why? Because everybody knows they got one of those alive inside of them, Theo said solemnly. They got to carry it into bed at night. So we can see he's a pretty smart young man, Theo Boykin. And he does put on one rip-roaring haunted house for Miss Spivey's Halloween party, and he is indeed the Bedouin at the window at the party itself, because the party is not for black people, it's for the white people in the town. So Theo, although Miss Spivey gives him a costume out of gratitude for all that he's done, can't invite him to the party, not at any rate that early in the school year. But what she does do is she asks Gladys whether there isn't something that we could do for, as Miss Spivey puts it, for your friend Theo. And Gladys has this response. That was the first time I ever heard anyone call Theo Boykin our friend. I could tell that it struck my brother Ralford, too. Ralford's 9 years old. And was amazed he had the sense not to say a word about it to Miss Spivey. There was no denying that we Cailiffs spent a lot of time with our neighbors, the Boykins. Eugene could almost always be persuaded to thrill and entertain us with feats of strength like lifting Ralford up off the ground with one hand, and Daddy liked to say that Mama and Mrs. Boykin were thick as thieves. But it was Theo and Force and my sister Ildred who really had a bond. If they weren't inventing labor-saving devices, a few of which, like the chicken feeder that didn't have to be filled but once a week, actually saved folks some labor, they were conducting experiments or repairing automobiles, sometimes both at once. Last spring, for example, when the circus was in Oconee and our T-model Ford was sitting half on and half off the lane with a hole in its fuel tank, Theo Boykin had an idea how they could fix it with a piece of copper tubing in a number 2.5 tin can. Force and Theo and Ildred worked all day long on that car. Daddy was gone to Macon at the time. We had just sat down for supper, Force and Ildred still smelling like gasoline, when we heard a popping sound from the yard out front, and here came our T-model Ford, chugging up the lane with Theo Boykin at the wheel, his eyes fixed in deepest concentration on the tin can they'd set in front of the windshield with a tail of copper tubing that snaked on down to disappear under the hood. Force had to drive almost as slow as walking, but that tin can fuel tank got us to Oconee in time for half the circus that night, including the part where the littlest flying Marengo twirled 3 times in midair, sparkling in her spangly outfit like a flame. All I could think of to tell Miss Spivey in response to her question about our friend Theo was that the teacher at the colored school, which was located in the country outside Three Step, was bound and determined to get him to college. Miss Templeton says there's a college he can go to where they can teach him to be a doctor or a lawyer, I said. In case Miss Spivey had any trouble believing that, Ralford added, they got colored doctors at the Negro Hospital in Macon, Mama told us. Have you ever heard of a college like that, Miss Spivey? I asked her, where Theo could go. Well, of course Theo can go to college, Miss Spivey said. He could go to Morehouse in Atlanta, for example, or Howard University back east. Those were 2 she could think of offhand, she said. I told her Ballard Normal School in Macon was the one Miss Templeton had in mind for him, at least to start. His mama said Atlanta was too far. One hitch was that he had to go to high school first. Now, Ballard had a high school too, but there was another hitch. Theo's father was dead and gone, passed away some years earlier in the middle of chopping wood to stoke the kilns over at the pottery during a week of record heat. That meant Theo was the man of the house and had been for a while. When he turned 16 last year, Mr. Veal over at the pottery offered him a job doing the same work his daddy had done, and Theo took it. It tore Miss Templeton up, but as Mrs. Boykin said, a boy's got to eat no matter how smart he is. You'd see him walking along the road on his way to work, his nose in a book, leaning forward into the pages like a person walking into a stiff wind. Miss Spivey gets involved in Theo's education. And the way she does that is she works with Miss Templeton, the teacher at the colored school, who has already been tutoring Theo for some time to prepare him cover high school so he could go to college. But Miss Spivey arranges to use to get Theo access to better school books, white school books. Gladys's brother, Force, is also 17 years old, and he goes to the military college in Milledgeville and can provide the school books for these tutoring sessions. They start out tutoring in the schoolhouse, but they get caught at that, and so they end up going out to the next county to Gladys's sister May's house. And it just so happens that Gladys's sister May, who's the mother of 5 children, didn't get a chance to finish high school either. So she joins the tutoring group. So we end up having Miss Templeton, Miss Spivey, Theo, Force, Gladys's brother Force, who goes to the military college and needs the tutoring because he's not a very good student, all at May's house, kind of covering the high school curriculum year by year. And they've been doing that for a while. They also use those sessions to talk about the Baghdad Bazaar. And what I'd like to do is read to you a conversation that takes place at one of those tutoring sessions. And it follows, I know there are some people here who were at the Anisfield Wolf Award ceremony, and there I read a little section that was about Miss Spivey trying to convince the townspeople that Eugene Boykin, in his imposing size and blackness, could play the Ifrit, which is an imposing genie, in the version of Aladdin and his wonderful lamp that Miss Spivey plans to put on as the centerpiece of the Baghdad Bazaar. So she's talking about that at the beginning of this. At May's for tutoring the following Saturday, Miss Spivey wanted us to be the first to know that both reverends and their wives were now in favor of Eugene playing the Ifrit in the Arabian Nights entertainment at the Baghdad Bazaar. She was largely correct in her belief that once she got the go-ahead from the reverends, everybody else in three-step would fall into line. She did not mention, although it became widely known, that Reverend Whitlock had been persuaded to change his position upon learning that the Ifrit was also known as the slave of the lamp, and could not but do the bidding of his master, the possessor of the lamp, who was, for most of the show, my brother Force, as Aladdin. Miss Spivey looked around the table, beaming at Force and May and Theo and Miss Templeton and me, as if she expected us to burst into applause. "Who knows," she said, "Eugene may be the first Negro actor ever to share the stage with white people in the state of Georgia." "What about the 4th of July when Theo recited the Declaration of Independence?" Force said. "There was white people on the stage with him." "There were," Miss Spivey said. "Yes, ma'am, a pile of them, important folks." "Well, I stand corrected," Miss Spivey declared, as cheerful as ever, and she moved right on into describing the special touches she had in mind for Eugene's costume, such as a golden fez for him to wear on his head, and a big curving sword and all, as befitted the all-powerful Ifrit, the greatest of all the Jinni, the mighty slave of the lamp. She expected Theo to be drawing these things as she described them, but I could see that he was doodling swirls of smoke in the margins of his notebook instead. Finally, Miss Spivey slowed down a bit and peered across the table to see how Eugene's costume was progressing. When she saw only smoky doodles in Theo's notebook, she asked him if he knew what she meant by a fez. At that, Theo, so to speak, erupted. "I don't see why Eugene has got to be the slave of the lamp," he burst out. "I don't see why he has got to be the slave of anything." This surprised Miss Spivey, we could tell. She tried to exchange looks with Miss Templeton, but Miss Templeton kept her eyes on the book in front of her on the table. Miss Spivey turned to Theo. The Ifrit is a very powerful jinn, you know. No task is beyond him. He can travel the globe in an instant. He can build a palace in the wink of an eye. With the snap of his fingers, she snapped hers, he can level a mountain or dry up the sea. Long as somebody lets him out of the lamp first, my sister May said. We all looked at her. Miss Spivey lowered her finger-snapping hand to the table. And commands him to do it, Theo added. What I wish I knew, Miss Spivey, is where does a jinn go when he's not doing somebody's bidding? That's what I've been thinking about. Where does he go? Does he get time off? Does he get to conjure things up for his own enjoyment? Or is he just stuck inside that little old lamp, all cramped up and small and incapacitated? Incapacitated was a vocabulary word from weeks ago. Suddenly, I was picturing Eugene Boykin curled up inside a silver gravy boat with his head between his knees. What did happen to a jinn when he wasn't doing somebody's bidding? I'd never thought to ask until now. Miss Spivey said she'd look into it. When I first began working on this book, I already knew, one of the very first things I knew was that Theo Boykin would be an important character in it. I didn't realize at first, I wasn't sure, would it be Theo Boykin who was the protagonist, or would it be Miss Spivey who was the protagonist? You know, the character whose fate, you know, determines the meaning of the story. And I soon, you know, I soon learned that it was Theo Boykin. And I had the book well underway while I continued to do research for the book. You know, I made trips to Georgia. I spent my childhood, I spent every vacation of my childhood and youth visiting my mother's relatives, staying with my mother's relatives in Georgia. So it was a place with which I was very familiar. I didn't know you could go anywhere. I didn't know you could take a vacation that wasn't a trip to Georgia. I thought they were synonyms. But I was making a number of these trips as I was working on the book. And at one point in working on the book, I needed an island. I needed one of the sea islands off the coast of Georgia for purposes of the plot. And so when we went to take my mother down to Georgia to visit her sister that summer, my husband and I went to Sapelo Island. I don't know if anybody's been lucky enough to visit Sapelo Island. It's one of those barrier islands, you know, there are all those along South Carolina and Georgia. And Sapelo Island is a particularly remarkable one in that there is a town, well, there's a nature preserve, and none of it is really sort of open to the public. The University of Georgia open or to public goings back and forth. You have to take a ferry, and then you have to have business there. And what your business can be that you would like to take the state park tour of Sapelo Island, so it's open to the public in that respect, and that's what we did. And this island has. There is a little town called Hog Hammock on Sapelo Island that is a many of the people who live in Hog Hammock, although there aren't very many people in Hog Hammock now, there used to be 7 such villages, and now there's only 1. And many of them are descendants of the enslaved people who worked the last plantation on Sapelo Island. And so that's one reason why the island didn't get turned into golf courses and things. I guess it was sort of all in one person's hands, and got delivered, went from the plantation owner's hands to R.J. Reynolds' hands, and consequently one of R.J. Reynolds' several wives makes a brief appearance in this book. But we went to Sapelo Island, and as I said, I was looking for connections between when I was Baghdad, we'll just lump it under that, and Georgia. And when we went to Sapelo Island, I made a discovery that, well, it was a discovery for me. And it has been a discovery, I find, for many people who read the book, although it shouldn't be. It shouldn't have been for me either, I guess. But after we were in the visitor center at Sapelo Island, and I was thinking, oh yes, this is the island I'm going to use for a certain part of the book. And my husband sort of, while I was looking at books, I thought I got to have some books on Sapelo Island, I have to know the history here. And my husband kind of took me by the sleeve over to a display case. There was also a sort of miniature museum in the visitor center where you bought your ferry tickets. And in the display case, there was the facsimile of a little notebook, like a little handmade notebook, and with handwriting in it. And the handwriting in it was Arabic script. And the tour guide had said nothing to us about the man to whom that notebook belonged. It belonged to a man named Bilali Muhammad, who was a literate West African Muslim who was kidnapped in West Africa when he was a teenager and spent much of his life in the Bahamas, and then was purchased, working as a slave in the Bahamas, was purchased by the man who put together this large last plantation on Sapelo Island. His name was Thomas Spalding. And Thomas Spalding purchased Bilali in, about maybe 1802, and for his knowledge of, not his knowledge of Arabic or of the Quran or anything like that, but for his knowledge of how to grow indigo, Sea Island cotton, and all the things that he'd been doing on the plantation he'd worked on for the last 30 years. And so Thomas Spalding hired him to be his plantation overseer. Hired him, bought him, and took him to Georgia along with his wife and 6 grown daughters, or depending on the account you read, and there aren't many accounts, but there are 2 you could choose from, will say that he was purchased with his 2 wives, and one of them will say he's purchased with his wife and 7 grown daughters, and the other will say that he was purchased with his 2 wives and 6 grown daughters, and there's not a way to know. But many of the people on Sapelo Island, in fact, most of the people on Sapelo Island, since they were people who worked on that last plantation, of which Bilali became very early on the overseer, they are in fact descendants of Bilali Muhammad. And so it was obviously an astonishing thing to me to find that I didn't have to stretch to bring the Middle East or all things Islamic to Georgia, because they had already been there. Of course, then I started reading in that direction, and I found out that Bilali was certainly not the only literate Muslim who was enslaved, particularly in Georgia and South Carolina in the United States, but also, in the Indies and in Latin America. So there was a great part of it was a small piece, but nevertheless, because of the huge numbers in the slave trade as a whole, there were a substantial number of people who were and continued to be practicing Muslims, that became a kind of first act that later emerged, in the 20th century as well. So I don't know, I haven't, let's see what time. Oh, it's almost 7 o'clock, so I don't know if I have time to read to you a portion of the book. Maybe I should, I think what I'll do is I'll stop and see if people would like to ask questions, and then I can answer a few questions, and maybe then finish with reading this last part of the book. I can tell you that as a result of what goes on with the Baghdad Bazaar, there is something terrible does happen that involves Theo Boykin. And so there is a part of the book in which everyone is gathered in the schoolhouse, and there's a kind of night of death-defying storytelling. And during that night of death-defying storytelling, the book does go back in time. It ends up going all the way back to 9th century Baghdad, and it tells us the story of Bilali's boyhood in West Africa, going on the pilgrimage, performing the Hajj with his father, and actually getting to Baghdad, which his father had a special interest in, due to his interest in a book called The Book of Ingenious Devices, which is also part of the Baghdad that's alluded to in the book. So can I ask, are there questions about the novel or about anything that I have read or said?
Thank you very much for this wonderful reading. I know what I'm reading next. Actually, I can't believe I haven't read it yet. It sounds fascinating.
Oh, that's good.
I was wondering, when you were talking about how you picked your main character, whether you were troubled at all by having someone who has a different race, a different gender from you, if that was in any way difficult for you, or did you think this is completely unproblematic? Were there others who thought this was problematic, that you picked a character that had a different race of your own?
Nobody has said anything to me about it. That's what I can. And in fact, that is not an issue that's been raised in, reviews or, I mean, it may have been, or in blogs or something, but not the ones that I've been aware of. I don't think that I don't have the skill and the artistry to. I couldn't have written the book from Theo's point of view. It's not written from Theo's point of view. It's written from the point of view of a little girl who's in some small ways modeled on my mother. So I kind of started from that well-known territory. And in fact, also not Theo himself, but the neighbors of the Cailiffs. Cailiffs is in fact a family name, my mother's maiden name. But the friendship between the Boykins and the Cailiffs is modeled on a friendship between my mother's grandmother and the mother of a black family who lived down the road from them. I point out that in a small town, in a very small town, you can't have physical segregation. So even though Theo Boykin could not, step into three-step school when Miss Chandler was still in charge of it, he could, he could go to the circus with the Cailiff kids as long as, there was nothing too official about that. He had to, at that time, sit in a different section. Other question? Yes?
Is there a reason why you selected this 11-year-old? Do you have children, and did this influence you by making the stories center, the story told by an 11-year-old?
Well, I do have children, and they're not 11 anymore, but they all were at one time. But and one of them was in some ways a little bit like Gladys Cailiff in a certain kind of precociousness that Gladys has, although it's precociousness within limits. But no, I don't think I was inspired so much by my children, although everything, is part of the choices that you make. But part of the reason it's good to have a narrator who doesn't know too much, who can approach things with an eye that doesn't know what to question, hasn't been too much predisposed, and can't ignore the evidence of her own eyes in favor of something she's being told about, how she should feel about, people like the Boykins. So that would be one reason that she's kind of on the cusp, still has enough of the innocence of childhood. There are a lot of 11-year-old narrators. I don't know if you've noticed that, but there really are. And I also was thinking that, I'm also thinking a little bit about To Kill a Mockingbird, of course, which, and in fact, this book was published, came out in the 50th anniversary year of To Kill a Mockingbird. And I read To Kill a Mockingbird, I think I was like about 11 or 12 when I first read it, and I've read it, several times since. And I loved To Kill a Mockingbird, and I'm sure I was in part inspired by that. well, actually, I know I was inspired by that because, in a sense, Theo Boykin as a character, and Gladys, and her family background, and the lawyer, I don't know anybody, if you're familiar with or you've read any part of the book, the only lawyer in Three-Step County, Mr. Gordon, is also the Grand Goblin of the Ku Klux Klan, so in the county. So there are certain, like, you know, themes or motifs from To Kill a Mockingbird that are turned upside down in this book. And one of the, I mean, the people, Gladys's people would be the people in the lynch mob, in a sense, you know, and as far as their presence in To Kill a Mockingbird. And clearly, you know, the best read person wasn't, the smartest and best read person in town wasn't Tom, the poor victim of false accusation, who was accused of, you know, raping a white woman. And so Theo actually came first in that response. I had this feeling that I wanted to write a story in which I'm afraid I wanted to flip Atticus Finch and Tom, in a sense, you know. I wanted to write a story in which the best read, smartest person was this young man, and the lawyer, not so much. So, and nobody, and actually a very few people, while everyone notices that, oh yes, you know, it's kind of set at the same time and covers the same era, raises some of the same issues as To Kill a Mockingbird, I don't know that anyone has noticed that particular thing, so what are you going to do? Here's a question.
Why the globalization element?
Oh, yes, there was another gentleman here I wanted to make sure that a question asked, why did I think of this Baghdad stuff in the first place, right? And before I knew anything about Bilali or anything about any Muslim, because Bilali, you know, not only what he was, a West African Muslim, very talented person, probably would have been, maybe would have been an imam if he hadn't gotten kidnapped, you know, and sold into slavery, or maybe he would have been a fabulously successful merchant or something else. But in any case, I didn't know about him. I didn't even know that I didn't even know about the Muslim, very much about Islam in West Africa at all, you know, which goes back to the 10th century. But here's what happened. You know, I told you I found that book, The Cailiffs of Baghdad. Well, on that very same day, before I found The Cailiffs of Baghdad, that book, I was sitting in the library, I was reading the newspaper, and the date was March 22nd, 2003. And I was reading an account, just a news account of the shock and awe bombing of Baghdad. And it was, although it was a news account, not a feature story, it was, it had a lot of detail in it, a lot of bombs and lit up sky and smoke and cries for help. And the last sentence was, in the story, in this news story, was ambulance sirens wailed. And when you know, sitting there in the library in Omaha, thinking of my country at war now, with the country whose ambulance sirens are wailing, struck me pretty heavily. Also, you know, even prior to that moment, the whole buildup, I found myself thinking, and in a very narrow-minded way, really, you could say, I found myself thinking, but this is the cradle of civilization. We're bombing the cradle of civilization, of our civilization, as well as several others, you know. I just took it into my head that I was going to write a book, and at that point, I wasn't sure. I knew I wanted to use my mother's people, my mother's milieu. I thought it was going to be in the next thing I wrote, although that wasn't. That wasn't an absolute requirement. But I knew I wanted to write a book where a group of Americans had a different relationship to Baghdad than the one that I thought had been given to us and would be, you know, given to our children and would take a long time to undo. I kept thinking about, well, I kept thinking about Vietnam, how long it took it to turn green. You know, and how that same sort of change in our thinking about a place that we used to think of in very different terms. Even if we thought of it in frivolous terms, like some of the crazier stories in 1,000 Nights and a Night, which are, in fact, Persian tales. In case anybody was going to tell me that, I know that. But not Iraqi, not from Baghdad, although many of them take place in Baghdad. There's a couple of them take place in China, as a matter of fact. Aladdin takes place in China, according to the 1,000 Nights and a Night. Other questions? That was the key one I needed to be sure and answer.
What are you writing about now?
Oh, that's a good question.
What countries are you involving?
Well, actually, at the current time, I am based in the United States in my next book, although the internet makes it, kind of takes it away from the locale. The internet globalizes it a little bit. In fact, much of the story, well, I don't know how much more I can tell you about that. I think it's there, I can't say too much more than that.
So I'm sure with this being in a completely different time than you were actually growing up and everything, you had to do a lot of research. So what was the most interesting thing you found during your research? Well,
it had to be Bilali Muhammad in his notebook on Sapelo Island. And in fact, I did get to actually turn the pages of the actual notebook, which is in the library at the University of Georgia in Athens. And it's just, like a little thing, like people have little journal books, handmade thing. And it's not ever really been entirely satisfactorily translated. There have been efforts since the 1930s, because Bilali gave that notebook, and this is a part of the story that I thought I might read, but I won't. He gave that notebook to a white minister who was a friend of his to sort of show him that, we too, for whatever reason, I don't know, I imagine he didn't say why he gave it to him. I imagined, and my Bilali gives it to him to show him that we too are people of intelligence or people of learning, he says. But what the minister doesn't know, and what we don't know, because the only notebook that came down to us is the one that Bilali gave to the minister, is how many other notebooks did Bilali have, and what was in them. And that also plays an important part in the book. As we go back in time, we find out what book it is that Bilali is really, as a boy, what book are he and his father seeking in Baghdad. I mean, they're going to they're performing the Hajj, the Quran is important to them, but there's another book as well that they're after, this Book of Ingenious Devices from 9th century Baghdad. So I guess that notebook was the most interesting thing.
Let's have one more question.
I'm just wondering whether you hit any roadblocks or had any problem with misrepresentation, because this was so long ago, you weren't there, and you were writing from about like situations or people or even places that you may have not been completely familiar with.
Well, that's true. I mean, although I would like, I don't think, again, I can't think of any, again, there may be some that exist, but I can't think of any review or blog or person in the audience who objected to the use of, history and its kind of amalgamation with imagination. I think a lot of people are pretty comfortable with the notion of historical fiction, and while this is not historical fiction in the sense that its purpose is not to recreate an era, nevertheless, you had to do a lot of the same kind of research in order to recreate Georgia in the 1930s, and then Baghdad in the 1930s, and then I had to be on Sherman's march coming back with one of Bilali's daughters from the Milledgeville area, where all of the slaves from that plantation were moved, and coming back to Sapelo Island, and I had to learn about Sapelo Island, and then I had to learn about West African pilgrimages There's a wonderful story, journal written by a West African imam who in the 19th century took a pilgrimage by sea. You go up to Rabat, and then you go through the Straits of Gibraltar across the Mediterranean, and then a little bit overland and down through the Red Sea, which was a route that some pilgrims took from West Africa, although some went across the top of Africa instead. So I had to learn about all of that. I had to learn about what would Bilali have eaten as a child. You know, what did they? Because it was a marvelous, I can't tell you what an enormous pleasure it was to imagine having read about him as an adult and what a remarkable person he was, and yet a slave until he died. And then to be able to imagine what his childhood might have been like. And of course, as you read the book, you make a link between Theo Boykin in 1938 and Bilali in West Africa in maybe the 1770s when he was a kid.
Thank you.
Thank you.